The private hangar at JFK Airport carried a quiet buzz of anticipation. Donald Trump and Melania, dressed in understated elegance to avoid attention, prepared for a discreet flight to a small Midwestern town where Donald was scheduled to meet with local farmers. The plan was simple: fly in, listen to the people, and leave. No fanfare, no cameras, just real conversations. Melania, draped in a soft beige coat and a delicate scarf, adjusted her handbag as she walked beside her husband. Donald carried his usual air of confidence, but there was a calm edge to his demeanor, as though he welcomed a brief escape from the spotlight. Yet, just as they approached the security checkpoint, a routine they had experienced countless times, something unexpected disrupted the quiet. The metal detector let out a sharp beep. A guard frowned and motioned for a secondary inspection. "Step aside, sir," the officer instructed firmly, unaware of who stood before him. Another guard gestured toward Melania, asking to inspect her handbag. Conversations around them softened to whispers as passengers began to recognize the couple. Phones subtly lifted. A hush swept across the terminal. Donald offered a polite nod. "Of course, do what you need to do," he said calmly. Melania glanced at him with composed eyes, though a flicker of unease passed over her face. "It's just routine," she whispered. Donald's faint smile carried an edge of intrigue. Routine can reveal more than we expect. Neither of them could have known that this ordinary inspection would uncover something far deeper. Something that would test patience, reveal hidden pain, and transform more than just their travel plans. The officer in charge was Jacob Harris, a 26-year-old former Marine who had recently joined airport security. His stance was sharp, his tone professional. Unlike the murmuring passengers around him, Jacob showed no sign of intimidation as he realized who stood before him. "Sir, I'll need you to remove your watch and step aside again," he said steadily. Donald arched a brow, slightly amused by the man's composure. Most people either froze or fumbled nervously in his presence, but Jacob treated him like any other traveler. That alone caught Donald's attention. Meanwhile, Melania gracefully handed her purse to a female guard. Her poise remained flawless, though inside she felt a growing unease. It wasn't the search itself that unsettled her, but the crowd gathering, phones raised, privacy fading by the second. Jacob focused on the scanner, his brow furrowing. "Ma'am, there's something unusual in your bag. I'll need to take a closer look." Melania blinked in mild surprise. "Of course, please, go ahead." The female guard carefully unzipped the bag, removing a wallet, a book, and sunglasses. Then, buried deep within a side pocket, something metallic glinted. The detector had not been mistaken. Jacob's hand hesitated as he reached in and pulled out a small, old-fashioned bronze locket, clearly aged, harmless in appearance, yet oddly out of place. Melania's face drained of color. Her fingers trembled slightly as she whispered, That isn't mine." The room fell silent. Passengers leaned forward, their whispers rising like a wave. Cameras clicked. The locket, though innocent in form, carried an air of mystery. Jacob turned the object over in his gloved hands. It didn't appear dangerous, but procedure demanded caution. Melania's eyes softened as a flicker of recognition stirred. I've seen this before," she murmured. Donald tilted his head. "What do you mean?" "I'm not sure," she said quietly. "It reminds me of something from years ago, but I've never owned it." Before Jacob could respond, a sudden gasp came from the line of passengers. An elderly woman pushed forward, her eyes wide and wet with tears. "That locket, how did you get that?" she cried. The guards instinctively stepped forward, but the woman raised trembling hands. "Please, that belonged to my daughter." The entire terminal froze. Donald turned sharply. "Your daughter?" The woman nodded, her voice breaking. "She died in a car accident 10 years ago. Her luggage was lost in the chaos. That locket, it was hers." The air grew heavy with emotion. Melania instinctively held the locket closer, her eyes misting. Fate, it seemed, had placed this woman's most cherished keepsake inside her bag. But how? The woman introduced herself as Margaret Cole, her silver hair gleaming under the harsh airport lights. Her hands shook as she whispered, "That belonged to my Emily. She wore it every day until the accident." Even the security staff faltered. Between protocol and compassion, Melania, moved by the woman's trembling voice, carefully held out the locket. But before returning it, she asked gently, "Do you remember what was inside?" Margaret's lips trembled into a faint smile. A photograph of her father, taken before he left for deployment. He never came home. Emily wore it to keep him close. Melania opened the locket with care. Inside lay a faded photograph of a young man in uniform, smiling proudly. On the opposite side, tiny engraved words shimmered faintly, "Forever with you." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The object was harmless, but its story carried immeasurable weight. Tears streamed down Margaret's face. "I thought it was lost forever. To see it again, it feels like she's here with me." Melania placed the locket gently into Margaret's trembling hands. "Then it has found its way home, just as it was meant to." The crowd, once curious and impatient, now stood in reverent silence. Phones lowered. Some passengers quietly wiped their eyes. Donald looked at Jacob, giving him a small nod of respect. Sometimes, son duty leads to something bigger than rules. but the mystery remained. A stern supervisor approached, frowning. A locket inside a bag where it doesn't belong, that's still suspicious. We need to know how it got there. Margaret, her tears slowing, nodded softly. I want to know, too. How could this appear, after all these years? Jacob promised to investigate. He hurried to the security office and reviewed footage of the baggage screening. There, on the tape, a handler lingered unusually long over Melania's bag. Jacob leaned closer and froze when the name badge came into view. T. Collins, racing back to the terminal. Jacob quietly informed his supervisor, who immediately dispatched officers. Moments later, a tall man with weathered features was escorted back in handcuffs. Donald's eyes narrowed. Why put that locket in her bag? What were you trying to do? The man T. Collins lowered his head, his voice rough with emotion. Because I couldn't carry it anymore. The crowd held its breath. What do you mean? Melania asked gently. Collins's voice cracked. I was the tow truck driver the night of the accident. I found the locket in the wreck. I meant to return it, but I couldn't. I blamed myself for not saving her. I kept it all these years. A reminder of what I failed to do. Margaret's knees weakened as she gasped. You were there. Collins nodded, tears spilling freely. I tried to pull her out. I swear I tried, but the flames, I never forgave myself. Donald stepped forward, his tone unexpectedly soft. You've been punishing yourself for 10 years, haven't you? Collins wiped at his face. Every single day. That locket became my prison. I didn't know how to let go. The crowd, once wary, now softened, their judgment replaced by understanding. Margaret clutched the locket to her chest. Her voice wavered. You should have come to me. You should have told me I couldn't. Collins whispered. I didn't deserve forgiveness. Melania stepped forward, her voice calm yet steady. Sometimes forgiveness isn't about deserving. It's about healing, not for the one who asks, but for the one who carries the pain. In that moment, the terminal, once just a stop for weary travelers, became something sacred, a place where grief, guilt, and fate intertwined, and where a simple piece of jewelry carried a story powerful enough to silence an entire airport. Asterisk. Margaret's tears blurred her vision as she reached out, her wrinkled hand trembling. You've given me back a piece of my daughter today, she whispered, her voice breaking. Even if it happened by accident, maybe this is how fate meant it to be. Collins looked up, startled. You mean, you don't hate me? Margaret's lips quivered, her eyes shimmering with grief and grace. I can't carry hate anymore. Hate only deepens the pain. If Emily could forgive, then so can I. A hush swept across the terminal. Passengers wiped away tears. Even the once stern supervisor, standing silently, visibly moved. Donald folded his arms, quietly impressed. This airport just turned into a church, he murmured. Melania offered a faint, knowing smile. Sometimes the heart speaks louder than rules. But even as the powerful moment settled, another surprise waited to unfold, one that would bring the crowd to silence again. Just as Margaret embraced the locket, the supervisor's radio crackled. Sir, a voice said urgently, we found something else in the handler's locker. You should come see this. Curiosity rippled through the crowd. Donald raised an eyebrow. What else could there be? Minutes later, officers returned, carrying a small, sealed envelope. Jacob stepped forward and handed it carefully to Margaret. We believe this belonged to your daughter as well, he said softly. It was addressed to you. Margaret's breath caught. Her trembling fingers opened the envelope with aching care. Inside lay a letter, the paper yellowed by time. She unfolded it slowly, her tears spotting the fragile page. Melania whispered gently, would you read it aloud? Margaret nodded, her voice breaking as she began. Her daughter's handwriting was uneven but full of life. Dear Mom, if you're reading this, it means I wasn't afraid to live fully. Please don't cry for me if I leave this world too soon. Remember me with joy, not sorrow. And please, forgive anyone who carries blame. Love always, Emily. The terminal fell into absolute silence. Every word sank deep into the hearts of those listening. Collins collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably. She wrote that for you, he choked out. Margaret pressed the letter to her chest, her tears mingling with a fragile smile. She knew, Margaret whispered. She knew forgiveness was the only way forward. Melania's eyes shimmered with emotion. She leaned toward Donald. This was meant to happen today. Donald simply nodded. For once, without a clever remark, just quiet respect. Jacob, standing nearby, felt his throat tighten. He had seen duty and pain in the Marines, but rarely had he witnessed healing this raw, this real. And in that crowded airport, strangers became witnesses to something far greater than coincidence. Fate had spoken. Margaret carefully folded the letter, her tears still falling. Turning toward Collins, she met his anguished eyes. Emily asked me to forgive, she said softly, and I forgive you. Collins shook his head violently. I don't deserve this. Donald finally spoke, his voice steady. Maybe not, but that's the point. Forgiveness isn't about earning, it's about freeing. The crowd nodded in quiet agreement. Travelers who moments earlier had been strangers now felt connected. Bound by the rawness of the moment, Melania gently took Margaret's hand. This locket returned to you today for a reason, she said softly. Not just to heal your heart, but to heal his as well. Collins broke down fully, burying his face in his hands. The supervisor, who had once insisted on rigid protocol, stood frozen. Humbled by what he witnessed, Margaret reached out again, resting her hand on Collins's shoulder. You carried this burden for too long, she said gently. Let it go. My daughter would never want you to suffer anymore. Jacob exhaled quietly, almost to himself. This is why I took this job, not just to protect, but to serve people. A woman holding her young child called out from the crowd, her voice breaking with emotion. This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Others nodded, wiping their eyes. Donald leaned toward Melania and whispered, people came here to catch flights, but they're leaving with something far greater. Melania's smile was tender. Hope, she said softly. Yes, Donald agreed. Hope. The terminal that had begun the day with suspicion and tension now pulsed with unity, forgiveness, and unexpected healing. But the day wasn't over. Fate still had one more turn to reveal. As the emotional wave settled, the airport intercom buzzed to life. Attention passengers. Flight 237 to Des Moines is now boarding. Donald chuckled quietly. Looks like our plane is ready, but somehow leaving feels wrong, like this story isn't finished. Melania nodded. Sometimes the journey we plan isn't the one we're meant to take. Before they could move, Margaret turned to them, her voice thick with gratitude. I need to thank you both. If it weren't for your patience and kindness, I wouldn't have my daughter's memory back today. Donald placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Ma'am, sometimes life puts you in the right place at the right time. We were just part of the plan. Jacob stepped forward, quietly. Mr. Trump, Mrs. Trump, I don't think anyone here will forget this. You turned an ordinary day into something extraordinary. Melania smiled warmly. We didn't do it alone. Everyone here played a part. The crowd responded with soft applause, not for celebrity, but out of shared gratitude. Just as Donald and Melania turned toward the gate, a small boy tugged on Margaret's coat. Miss, can I see the locket? It looks like it has magic. Margaret knelt, opening it carefully for him. The boy studied the picture inside, then looked up with wide, innocent eyes. Your daughter's dad was a hero, he said simply. That means she was too. Margaret's tears returned, but this time they were sweet, healing tears. Yes, sweetheart, she said, hugging him gently. She was Donald, and Melania exchanged a quiet glance. They both knew that the ripple from one lost locket had already touched countless hearts, and its impact wasn't finished yet. The stern supervisor, who had once demanded strict adherence to rules, stood silently, watching Margaret and Collins with new understanding. For years he had treated his job as a checklist of regulations, but today, something inside him shifted. He approached Donald quietly. Sir, I owe you and your wife an apology. I was too focused on rules to see the people in front of me. Donald gave a small, knowing smile. Rules matter, but people matter more. The supervisor swallowed hard, his eyes softening. He turned to Jacob. You handled this better than I did. Maybe I could learn something from you. Jacob straightened, humble but proud. We both did our jobs, sir, but today reminded me sometimes our job is bigger than the badge. Nearby, Collins wiped his eyes. I'm ready to accept whatever consequences come, but at least I don't feel chained anymore. Margaret placed her hand gently on his shoulder. You don't deserve punishment, she said softly. You deserve peace. Melania stepped forward, her voice warm and sure. And sometimes peace begins with forgiveness. The crowd around them had thinned, but those who lingered carried something deeper, a quiet reminder that humanity still shines in the most unexpected places. The supervisor glanced around, taking in the terminal that only hours earlier felt like any other. This place, he whispered, almost to himself. It won't feel the same again. Donald smiled faintly. Maybe that's a good thing. The terminal seemed to exhale, as though the very air had shifted. Just as Donald and Melania began walking toward their gate, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes stepped forward hesitantly. Excuse me, she said softly. I wasn't going to say anything, but after what I witnessed today, I feel like I need to. The crowd turned, curious. The woman introduced herself as Linda, a nurse traveling home after a long shift in New York. Her voice trembled. I lost my son 3 years ago in Afghanistan. I've been angry ever since, at the world, at myself, at everyone. But watching Margaret forgive just now, she paused, wiping her eyes. It reminded me that maybe it's time I forgive, too. Melania stepped closer, her expression tender. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting the pain. It means choosing not to let it control you. Linda nodded slowly, her tears falling freely. For the first time, I think I understand. Donald lowered his voice, his words gentle but firm. Your son was a hero. He gave his life for something greater than himself. Don't let anger steal the meaning of his sacrifice. Linda's tears shimmered into a faint, grateful smile. Thank you, she whispered. I think I can finally breathe again. Margaret stepped forward and embraced Linda warmly. You're not alone anymore, she said softly. The nurse clung to her, sobbing quietly, and in that bustling airport where time usually raced forward, Without pause, life slowed long enough for healing to take root. Moments later, another announcement echoed overhead. Attention passengers. Flight 237 has been delayed for additional checks. A few passengers groaned, but Donald chuckled. Looks like we're not leaving just yet. Melania tilted her head, a gentle smile forming. Maybe the universe isn't finished with us. Instead of frustration, the crowd seemed to welcome the delay, as though destiny itself wanted them to stay connected just a little longer. Jacob used the unexpected pause to approach Collins. You okay? He asked quietly. Collins exhaled, the weight of 10 years finally lifting. For the first time in a decade, he said softly, I think I am. Collins nodded slowly, a faint lightness in his eyes. For the first time in 10 years, he said softly, I feel lighter. I didn't think that was possible. Margaret clutched a locket to her chest, her voice trembling but sure. It was meant to return to me today, she whispered. Not a day sooner, not a day later. Donald overheard and smiled gently. Life, he said, has a way of keeping its own schedule. Melania rested her hand on his arm, her gaze thoughtful. Delays aren't always setbacks, she added. Sometimes they're divine timing. The crowd around them seemed to agree. Strangers began speaking to one another, sharing stories of loss, forgiveness, and unexpected hope. What had once been a tense, impatient terminal now hummed with a quiet unity. Even the flight delay, usually a source of frustration, felt like part of a greater plan. Jacob leaned against the counter, lost in thought. He had taken this job after leaving the military, thinking it was just a way to pay the bills. But today had changed him. His supervisor approached, eyes soft with respect. You did well, Harris. Better than I did. Jacob shook his head. It wasn't me, it was her. He nodded toward Margaret, and then he motioned toward Donald and Melania. I was just in the right place at the right time. The supervisor sighed. Still, you reminded me what this job should be about: people, not just bags and scanners. Jacob allowed a faint smile. Maybe that's the lesson. We can't control fate, but we can choose how we respond when it shows up. Melania, overhearing, smiled warmly. Wise words. Donald patted Jacob's shoulder. Son, you'll go far with that attitude. Trust me, usually stoic. Jacob felt a lump rise in his throat. He realized that this day had given him something unexpected: purpose. Across the terminal, Margaret sat quietly with the locket warm in her palm. Collins sat across from her, still unsure of where he belonged. I don't want you living in shame anymore, she said firmly. Come visit me. Tell me about that night, everything I couldn't be there for. Help me remember Emily as more than just a tragedy. Collins's eyes widened. You'd let me do that? Margaret nodded slowly. Forgiveness isn't the end. It's the beginning of something new. The crowd listened in silence, the weight of her words settling over them. Many found themselves reflecting on the grudges they carried and the possibility of letting them go. Donald leaned close to Melania, whispering, that woman has more strength than most leaders I know. Melania smiled softly. Because she leads with her heart. The little boy who had earlier asked to see the locket returned, tugging gently on Margaret's sleeve. Miss, do you think your daughter can see you now? Margaret's eyes softened. She knelt down and nodded. Yes, sweetheart, I think she can. The boy smiled. Then she's happy you forgave. Those simple words rippled through the crowd more powerfully than any speech. Adults who had carried pain for years suddenly saw it through the innocent clarity of a child. Donald whispered to Melania. Out of the mouths of babes, she squeezed his hand, her eyes shining. For the first time in years, Collins straightened his shoulders. Margaret, he said, voice steady, I can't undo the past, but maybe I can honor Emily by living better, by helping others instead of hiding. That's exactly what she'd want. Margaret replied gently. Jacob stepped forward. You should volunteer, he suggested. Maybe speak to others who carry guilt. They'd listen to someone who knows what it feels like. Collins nodded slowly. Maybe that's why the locket came back today, to remind me it's time to give back. The crowd applauded quietly. Donald smirked. Looks like the man's got a second chance. Melania added softly, and he's wise enough to take it. Finally, the announcement came. Flight 237 is now ready for boarding. Donald glanced around the terminal, reluctant to leave. Strange, Melanian, we came here to fly, but it feels like we were grounded for something greater. She nodded. Sometimes the most important journeys don't involve planes. Passengers who had shared the experience clapped softly for Donald and Melania as they walked toward the gate, not because of fame, but because they had all been part of something life-changing. Margaret hugged Melania tightly. Thank you for your grace, she whispered. Melania smiled back. And thank you for your strength. As Donald and Melania prepared to board, Jacob stopped them. Mr. Trump, Mrs. Trump, I'll never forget today. It changed how I see my duty. Donald shook his hand firmly. Good, never lose that. The world needs people who see more than rules, Melania added softly, and people who believe in second chances. Jacob nodded, his voice thick with emotion. I'll carry that lesson forever. As the plane lifted off, Donald stared out the window. deep in thought. This was supposed to be just another trip, he murmured, but it became something more. Melania smiled gently. Yes, a reminder that even in the most ordinary places, extraordinary things can happen. Back in the terminal, Margaret held her daughter's locket close. Colin sat beside her, no longer burdened by guilt but filled with a quiet hope. Linda, the nurse, texted her family to say she was ready to forgive. And Jacob, the young guard, stood taller, his heart steadier, his purpose renewed. That day, the airport had witnessed delays, tension, and strict procedures. But it had also witnessed forgiveness, healing, and the unmistakable power of hope. And every passenger who left carried more than luggage. They carried a story, one they would never forget. Because sometimes the most profound discoveries aren't about what's hidden in a bag. They're about what's revealed in the human heart.